May 1933, a barge packed with over 6,000 human beings arrived at a desolate, mosquito-infested sandbar in the middle of Siberia's Ob River. These people, many of them intellectuals, artists, and ordinary citizens from Moscow and Leningrad, had been swept up in Stalin's brutal campaign to cleanse Soviet cities of socially harmful elements. They were given no tools, no shelter, no food beyond a few sacks of flour, and no means of escape. Within 13 weeks, 2/3 of them would be dead. The survivors would tell stories so horrific that Soviet authorities buried the evidence for decades. This was Nazino Island, though history would come to know it by another name, Cannibal Island. To understand how such an atrocity could occur, we must first grasp the poisonous political atmosphere of the Soviet Union in the early 1930s. Joseph Stalin had consolidated absolute power over the world's largest country, and he wielded that power with ruthless paranoia. His vision of transforming the USSR into a modern industrial superpower required complete social control and the elimination of anyone who might pose even a theoretical threat to his authority. The year 1933 was particularly dark in Soviet history. Ukraine and other grain-producing regions were suffering through the Holodomor, a man-made famine that would kill millions. Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture had destroyed the traditional farming system, and rather than admit failure, he requisitioned grain at gunpoint, leaving rural populations to starve. In cities, the situation was different but no less controlled. Urban residents needed internal passports to live in major cities, and Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, had sweeping powers to arrest anyone deemed undesirable. The policy that would lead to the Nazino tragedy was called passportization, a bureaucratic term that masked its brutal reality. In December 1932, the Soviet government introduced an internal passport system, ostensibly to control migration and maintain order. In practice, it became a tool for social cleansing. Those without proper documentation could be arrested, and the definition of who qualified as socially harmful was deliberately vague. Who fell into this category? The homeless, certainly, but also the unemployed, petty criminals, prostitutes, former nobles, priests, merchants, kulaks, supposedly wealthy peasants, and anyone else the NKVD deemed problematic. In the spring of 1933, as part of a campaign to beautify Moscow and Leningrad before May Day celebrations, the secret police began mass roundups. Tens of thousands of people were arrested in a matter of weeks, sometimes for legitimate minor crimes, but often simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time without proper papers. The authorities faced an immediate problem: what to do with all these prisoners? The Gulag system was already straining under the weight of Stalin's paranoia. Someone in the bureaucracy proposed a solution that must have seemed elegant in its simplicity. Send the prisoners to Siberia's undeveloped regions where they could, voluntarily, settle and cultivate the land. They would transform uninhabited wilderness into productive Soviet territory, while simultaneously removing themselves from the cities. It was called special resettlement, and it would become one of the most poorly planned and brutally executed policies in Soviet history. In early May 1933, approximately 6,000 to 7,000 people were herded onto trains in Moscow and Leningrad. The prisoners represented a cross-section of Soviet urban society. There were genuine criminals, pickpockets, black marketeers and thieves, but there were also teachers, engineers, musicians and students who had simply been in the wrong place during a police sweep. Some had been arrested for speculation, the crime of trying to buy or sell goods outside official channels, which in the chaos of Soviet economic planning might mean anything from running a black market operation to selling a few personal possessions to buy food. Many prisoners had no idea what was happening. They were told they were being sent to work settlements in Siberia, but the details were vague. Some imagined they would be working on construction projects or farms. None could have imagined the reality that awaited them. The journey itself was a nightmare. The prisoners were packed into freight cars, sometimes more than 50 people to a car designed for cargo, or, at best, 40 people. Sanitation was non-existent. A single bucket served as a toilet for dozens of people. Food was scarce and irregular. The trains moved slowly through the vastness of Russia, stopping frequently but offering no relief to the suffering prisoners inside. As the trains rolled eastward, disease began to spread. Typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses flourished in the cramped, filthy conditions. Some prisoners died before ever reaching Siberia. Their bodies were simply thrown from the moving trains, a grim preview of what was to come. After days or weeks of travel, accounts vary on the exact duration, the trains reached Tomsk, the Siberian city on the Tom River. Here, the prisoners were transferred to barges for the next leg of their journey. The barges would take them north along the Ob River system into the remote taiga wilderness, where their special settlement awaited. The barge journey added new layers of misery. Packed onto open decks or in fetid holds, the prisoners endured rain, cold, and the merciless attention of guards who viewed them as less than human. Food rations were minimal. Many prisoners later recalled that they received only a few hundred grams of bread per day, barely enough to sustain life, let alone the physical labour they were supposedly being sent to perform. When the first barge arrived at Nazino Island on May 18, 1933, the prisoners must have felt their hearts sink. This was their destination, this desolate spit of land. Nazino Island, properly called Nazino Sandbar, was barely an island at all. It was a small, low-lying piece of land in the Ob River, roughly 3 kilometres long and half a kilometre wide. Dense forest covered parts of it, but much of the island was just bare sand and marsh. There were no buildings, no infrastructure, no signs of human habitation. The surrounding taiga stretched in all directions, an ocean of trees that was beautiful and deadly in equal measure. More barges arrived over the following days, disgorging their human cargo onto the sand. Soon over 6,000 people crowded the island. The guards, OGPU troops, predecessors to the NKVD, established a perimeter and made clear that anyone who tried to escape would be shot. Not that escape was a realistic option. The Ob River was wide and cold, the surrounding wilderness was hundreds of kilometres of trackless forest, and the prisoners were already weak from their journey. The full horror of the situation became apparent when the authorities distributed supplies. Each prisoner received approximately 300 grams of flour. That was all. No cooking equipment, no pots or pans, no matches or firewood. The flour was often damp and mouldy from the journey, and without any way to make fire, it was nearly impossible to turn it into edible food. Some prisoners tried to eat it raw, mixing it with river water to create a thin, uncooked paste. This caused severe digestive problems and did little to address their hunger. There were no tools for building shelter, no axes, no saws, no nails. The prisoners were expected to somehow construct housing from the forest using their bare hands. A few managed to build crude lean-tos from branches and moss, but most had no shelter at all. When it rained, which it did frequently in the Siberian spring, thousands of people simply sat in the mud, soaked and shivering. The lack of organisation was staggering. The commandant of the operation, Tsepkov, seems to have had no actual plan for what the prisoners should do. They weren't put to work on any productive project. They weren't organised into work brigades. They weren't even properly counted or registered. They were simply left to survive, or not, on this miserable sandbar. Within days, people began to die. The weakest, the elderly, the sick, children, went first. Their bodies were left where they fell. There was no system for burial, no tools to dig graves in the sandy soil. Soon, corpses littered the island, and the survivors were too weak and demoralised to dispose of them properly. What happened next remains almost incomprehensible, even in the context of Stalin's brutal regime. Hunger drives human beings to extremes, and the prisoners on Nazino Island were not just hungry, they were starving, in a desperate, all-consuming way that erased thought beyond the immediate need for calories. The first murders for meat occurred within the first week. The accounts from survivors are fragmentary and disturbing. Stronger prisoners, often the actual criminals who had been arrested alongside the innocent, began targeting the weak. At night, screams would echo across the island as victims were attacked, killed, and butchered. By dawn, new corpses would be found, carved up, with pieces missing. The guards knew what was happening. How could they not? But they did nothing to stop it. In fact, some accounts suggest that guards found the situation amusing, a kind of morbid entertainment. They had food, supplies came regularly for the OGPU troops, but they shared none of it with the dying prisoners. Instead, they watched from their posts as the island descended into a real-life nightmare. One survivor, Theophania Belina, later testified about finding a young woman's body near the forest edge. The woman's breasts and thighs had been cut away. Belina realised with horror that she had seen others cooking meat over small fires and claimed it was bird or animal. She now understood what they had really been eating. Another survivor, Fyodor Machulski, described organized groups of cannibals who worked together. These groups would identify weak targets, often people who were already half dead from starvation, and kill them for food. They justified their actions by claiming they were only killing people who would die anyway. But this rationalization grew thinner as the violence escalated. Soon, relatively healthy people were being murdered in the night. The cannibalism took different forms. Some survivors drew a moral distinction between those who scavenged flesh from the already dead and those who actively murdered for meat. But in the extreme conditions of Nazino, such distinctions probably mattered little. Both represented the complete breakdown of human society and moral restraint. Women suffered particularly horrifically. Some guards and stronger male prisoners took women as slaves, offering protection in exchange for sexual access and labour. These women were sometimes kept alive longer than others, but at a terrible price. Those without protectors were often targeted for murder and consumption first, as they were less able to defend themselves. Children, of whom there were surprisingly many among the deportees, had almost no chance of survival. Too weak to defend themselves, unable to build shelter or find food, they died in droves. Some survivors later spoke with haunting grief about watching children die and being powerless to help them. News of the catastrophe eventually reached higher authorities, though how much they cared is debatable. Nazino was not the only special settlement experiencing problems. The entire program was a disaster across Siberia, but it was perhaps the worst. In early June, an instructor from the Communist Party named Vasily Velichko was sent to investigate conditions at various settlements. When he reached Nazino, he was shocked by what he found. In his report, Velichko described islands strewn with corpses, survivors who looked like animated skeletons, and a complete absence of any productive work or organisation. Velichko documented specific incidents of cannibalism, though Soviet bureaucratic language sanitized the horror. He noted that some settlers engaged in consumption of human flesh, and that isolated incidents of murder for the purpose of cannibalism occurred. This dry language concealed a reality of mass murder and desperate survival cannibalism. His report also noted the gross incompetence and corruption of the guards and administrators. The commandant, Sepkov, was often drunk. Supplies that should have gone to prisoners were stolen by guards. There was no medical care, no sanitation, no organisation whatsoever. The settlement was nothing more than a dumping ground for unwanted humans, left to die with bureaucratic efficiency. Velichko's report went up the chain of command, but the response was limited. Some administrators were reprimanded or reassigned. Small improvements were made to supply deliveries, but the fundamental policy didn't change, and no serious effort was made to rescue the survivors or acknowledge the catastrophe. By late June 1933, it became clear even to Soviet authorities that the Nazino operation was unsustainable. The death rate was too high, and embarrassing reports were circulating. A decision was made to evacuate the survivors and shut down the settlement. The evacuation itself was chaotic and cruel. The survivors, perhaps 2,000 to 2,500 people out of the original 6,000 plus, were herded onto barges and transported to other locations. Some were sent to other work settlements that, while harsh, were at least minimally organised with basic shelter and food. Others were simply released, left to wander the Siberian wilderness and find their way to towns if they could. Many who survived Nazino Island died in the weeks after evacuation, their bodies too damaged by starvation and disease to recover. Then came the cover-up. Soviet authorities had no interest in publicising this disaster. It revealed the fundamental cruelty and incompetence of Stalin's policies, and admitting such failures was dangerous in a system built on propaganda and fear. Documents about Nazino were classified. Officials involved were told to keep silent. The few reports that existed were buried in archives where they would remain hidden for decades. The survivors themselves were scattered across the vast Soviet Union. Many were threatened with arrest if they spoke about their experiences. In Stalin's USSR, telling the truth about state crimes was itself a crime. Survivors who tried to seek justice or tell their stories risked being sent back to the Gulag, or worse. For over 50 years, the Nazino catastrophe remained virtually unknown outside a small circle of survivors and officials. It was not mentioned in Soviet history books, not taught in schools, not acknowledged by the government. An atrocity that killed thousands of people simply vanished from the official record. The story of Nazino Island only began to emerge in the late 1980s during Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, openness. As Soviet archives began to open and censorship loosened, historians and journalists started uncovering the truth about Stalin's crimes. A Russian journalist named Nicholas Wirth was among the first to investigate Nazino in depth. Digging through newly accessible archives, Wirth found Velichko's report and other documents that revealed the scope of the tragedy. His research brought the story to wider attention and prompted other historians to investigate. In 1988, a memorial expedition visited Nazino Island. They found human remains still scattered across the sandbar, bones and skulls half buried in the sand and forest soil. The physical evidence confirmed the documentary record. Thousands of people had died there, and their bodies had never been properly buried. Survivors, now elderly, began to tell their stories. Theophania Belina, who had been a young woman when she was sent to Nazino, gave testimony about the horrors she witnessed. Other survivors added their voices, providing first-hand accounts that made the dry, bureaucratic language of official reports come alive with human suffering. The full death toll will never be known with certainty. Soviet records were incomplete and often deliberately falsified. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 4,000 people died either on Nazino Island or in the immediate aftermath of evacuation. Some historians believe the true number may be higher, perhaps 5,000 or more. These deaths occurred over roughly 13 weeks, an average of over 300 deaths per week, or more than 40 per day. The causes of death were varied but interconnected: starvation, exposure, disease, murder, and the simple despair that caused some people to simply lie down and wait for death. The cannibalism, while the most sensational aspect of the story, was a symptom of the deeper crime: the deliberate abandonment of thousands of human beings without adequate food, shelter, or care. What can we learn from the Nazino tragedy? What relevance does a Siberian atrocity from 1933 have for us today? First, Nazino demonstrates the dangers of dehumanization. When any group of people is labeled as undesirable, harmful, or enemies, the groundwork is laid for atrocity. The specific ideology doesn't matter: communist, fascist, nationalist, religious. Once we stop seeing others as fully human, violence becomes easier to justify and implement. Second, it illustrates the importance of accountability and transparency. The Soviet system's culture of secrecy and fear allowed terrible policies to be implemented and covered up. Had there been mechanisms for public scrutiny, independent media, or genuine accountability, the Nazino catastrophe might have been prevented, or at least mitigated. Third, Nazino shows how bureaucratic systems can enable atrocity. The deportations were carried out by people following orders, filling quotas, filing reports. At each level, individuals could tell themselves they were just doing their jobs, following procedures. The cumulative effect was mass murder, but no individual had to take full responsibility. Fourth, it reminds us of the gap between ideology and reality. The Soviet Union's official ideology spoke of building a workers' paradise, of scientific planning and social progress. The reality was chaos, suffering, and death on a massive scale. We should be skeptical of any ideology that promises utopia, particularly when it requires the elimination or forcible transformation of groups of people. Fifth, Nazino demonstrates human resilience. Despite unspeakable conditions, some people survived. Some maintained their humanity, even in hell. Some helped others at great personal cost. The story is not just one of horror, but also of endurance and the stubborn persistence of human dignity. Today, there is a small memorial on Nazino Island. It's a simple affair: a wooden cross and a plaque, erected in the 1990s after the story finally became public. Few people visit. The island remains remote and difficult to reach. But its existence acknowledges that something terrible happened there, that thousands died, and that their deaths should not be forgotten. In Russia, the memory of Stalin remains contested. Some view him as a monster, responsible for millions of deaths. Others, particularly older Russians and nationalists, remember him as the leader who defeated Hitler and made the USSR a superpower. The full reckoning with Stalin's crimes that many historians hoped would follow the Soviet collapse has been incomplete. Nazino Island challenges this ambivalence. It's difficult to find anything to defend or rationalize about what happened there. It was neither militarily necessary, economically productive, nor politically useful. It was simply a crime, a brutal, stupid, pointless crime that revealed the true nature of Stalin's regime. The survivors of Nazino, those few who lived long enough to see their story acknowledged, wanted the world to know what happened. They wanted the dead to be remembered, the crime to be named. In speaking out, often at great personal cost, they performed an act of witness that honoured those who died and warned future generations about the consequences of unchecked state power. As we move further from 1933, as the last survivors die and living memory fades, the burden of remembering falls to historians, to memorials, to stories like this one. Nazino Island must not be forgotten. It stands as a warning about what humans are capable of, both the atrocities we can commit and the suffering we can endure. In remembering, we honour the dead and remind ourselves of the fragility of civilization and the constant need to defend human dignity against the forces that would destroy it. The sand and forest of Nazino Island have long since reclaimed the bones of those who died there, but their story lives on, a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the importance of bearing witness to even the darkest chapters of our history. Follow our channel to hear more interesting war and history stories first. Your support is really appreciated and helps us grow.